Okay, we're trying to get our final clearances set up for Endplay on this 4L60E here. And right now, we have all of the parts up to the output shaft snap ring down here assembled. So all the bearings and everything are in. And I wanted to, difficult to find information on output shaft Endplay in all of the detail. There's Sonic's article about checking the output shaft Endplay with all of these parts out of the case on the output shaft. And that I figured out here. When I move, let me make sure I can get it on camera here. Alright, so sorry for the focus, but when I pick up, I've got my hand on the back of the output shaft, and I'm picking it up, and you can see the snap ring there move, and that snap ring is bottoming out against, this whole parts stack up that's in here. When I push it the other way, hang on, let me move this so we can see it. Alright, so I've got this sitting on my lap here, and I've got my hand on the planet carrier in the inside of here, and I'm kind of centering this because it's on its side, but holding this center, and I'm putting force towards the rear of the transmission case so that this parts stack up can't move right now. And we're gonna look here, hang on, watch your hand for a second. We're gonna look right in here at where the output shaft meets what we're looking at there, that shiny spot, and the part in front of it is the, right there. That's where the output shaft meets the rear ring gear hub. So if I force all of these parts rearward, and then we just grab this output shaft and move it in and out. Oh, you're moving the whole case. You're pulling me. Just move the, it should move real easy. There you go. So that movement right there is a relatively small movement. Right now it measures 35 thousandths. That is the spec that we see listed as actual output shaft Endplay. Now we have a different story if I set this back up and I don't hold these internal parts. So I'm going to do that. Alright, so now back to my little bit of movement. If I grab the rear of the output shaft, lift that up, and you can see what is our actual output shaft Endplay. And that's just the output shaft itself moving between the snap ring and the flange on the back of the output shaft, in between or within all of these parts. Now, with this only assembled up to this point, if I push upward hard enough, I can move this a whole 1/8 of an inch. And that had me really concerned because, and let me think about how to say this. When I'm moving that 1/8 of an inch, what's stopping me from moving all of these parts forward is basically the rear planetary. Let me grab that from over here. Rear planetary. Throw it on the ground for good measure. Oh, I broke it. Just kidding. But this is hitting the back of the center support. The big piece that's locked into the case with your anti-clunk spring that has the race in the center for the rear sprag, or the low roller sprag that splines onto this. So with the front of the transmission apart, I'm moving my my planetary carrier, my ring gear, my hub, everything in the back via the flange on the back of the output shaft that's up there that we just looked at. Moving all of that upward until this bottoms out. So I was concerned about the clearance between basically the center support and the back of the case, but things change, and there's a reason why there's a reference to input shaft end play and total unit end play. And let me see if I can demonstrate that. All right, so we're looking here at our assembled input shaft and drum with the front sprag assembly and sun gear in it. Behind this whole hub assembly, there's a bearing that pushes up against the bottom of the input shaft down inside of here. This gets set down against the Torrington bearing that's captive in the planets. All right, so this can't really move once I push on it, and once this is set up against there, it's up against it. So stand this up. When this whole thing is assembled, and we're leaving the reverse drum out because the reverse drum is kind of floating between the back of this and the washer that goes up here, so we're not worried about that. But with my pump and stator on, that stator, back of the stator, is sitting against, oh well, my bearing fell out, but there's the shim that adjusts the end play. There's the bearing that goes up on top of it where the stator rides, or where it rides on the stator. And there's the stator in the pump. And the stator obviously is attached to the pump, which is attached to the case. It's bolted down. You have your gasket that goes in between. So this is lock solid. The stator is lock solid. When I add, and I just want to make sure that's clear. So when this is installed, the pump is bolted onto this surface in the case. So the pump cannot move, the stator cannot move. So what we're doing here when we add these shims is we're pushing, basically, well, we're taking up movement, but we're forcing this rearward. We're forcing it to stay more rearward. When we force this to stay more rearward, we're keeping that sun gear more rearward, because that's all up against, all those parts up against one another. That sun gear is pushing on that Torrington bearing. That Torrington bearing, well, that's pushing on the carrier. The carrier is up against the reaction hub, or the reaction shaft, which is up against the sun gear, and on and on. And the oh my goodness, the low roller race, it can move up and down within the center support. So even though the center support is locked in and it can't go anywhere, but what the snap ring allows it to move just a little bit, the whole part stack up through the race that can slide gets forced towards the rear of the transmission when we add these shims right here. So that takes up the slop all the way down to the rear hub, which, let's see if I got one here. Okay, I dug out a rear planetary ring gear and hub. So all those parts all the way from the shim between the stator and the input to this hub and this bearing that sits against the case are being sandwiched together when you adjust your front end play through those shims. Because even though I can bottom out these parts against the center support now, that doesn't matter once you take the slop up and that inner race can slide within the rear sprag assembly. So you've got your total unit end play or your front end play to adjust. That's what we just went through. And that's adjusting the clearance of all these parts. So I actually had about a 12 thousandths clearance on my first check here, despite the fact that I can move this 1/8 of an inch. And then I have this 35 thousandths movement of the output shaft, which once all these parts are sandwiched in here, that movement is going to be just movement of the output shaft, since it's not physically connected to the input shaft other than through the little rubber seal for the lubrication that goes through this. So there's some variation in the specifications on this amount of movement, but it seems like it's not really a spec anywhere. But I just wanted to clarify the difference between output shaft end play and total unit end play or input shaft end play. Alright, so here is a PowerPoint showing the output shaft and all the parts assembled onto it on the bench. We're going to arrow down through here, showing the snap ring groove, showing putting the snap ring on, installed. Okay, then they're supporting this by the front of the output shaft, so the sun gear is not touching, and they are checking that clearance right there, and that they're saying that's a good assembly. Must have very little play, 10 to 20 thousandths or so. There's a bad assembly. So by that metric, my assembly's bad because I've got 35 thousandths, and I'm going to check this again on the bench. But there is a way to correct this, and I should add, if you have to make sure that all of your parts are matched, because there's a lot of things that can go wrong as far as your bearings, your reaction hub, your planetaries. So you have to make sure that all of your parts fit together. And there's a lot that goes into that. So we're going to skip to assuming that we have the correct parts installed and we still have the wrong amount of end play in the rear here, or rather too much end play. I'm going to tear this back down and assemble it outside of the case. I also just wanted to show, here is my method for holding the output shaft up. Not the best method, but it's a working method. And let's get this in here. Boop. There we are. And that'll hold me up while I get my snap ring out. Parts pulled out up to the center support, which is snap ringed in here. And you can see this part's moved quite a bit. I'm going to go around the back here and push on the back of the hub where it's coming through. Camera set up here so I can do that by myself. Alright, so there's my finger. I'm on the back of that hub. That movement right there before that planet carrier bottoms out on the back of that center support, that's where my 1/8 of an inch is coming from. So, you know, if I had this set up, if I just had this inner race in here and I left the center support out, left the snap ring out, then I could pick the whole thing up and out the front of the transmission. Let me tear this down the rest of the way. There we are with it all apart. And set this up. Alright, so before I put this together, I just want to show, here's our rear planetary hub. Right there is that flange where this thing seats against, and this can't go any further rearward. And then right here is your snap ring groove that holds the parts on the other way. So let me throw these all together. Okay, here we go. All right, so let's start with, let me get this bearing out of here. Or no, it's pretty well stuck on there. We'll leave it. All right. Output shaft. Rear ring gear and hub. Bearing is just stuck on there with grease, so I'm going to leave it on there. Slides up against the flange. All right. Rear planet carrier. This one has an oil slinger on it. Everything's more difficult when you're filming. There we go. Got that on there. Don't really want to take my sprag back apart, so I'm going to set this whole thing on here. Alright. Sun shell with the bearing. That on in there. This is the Sonic Smart Shell, that's why it has the bearing. Slide that in. Sonic's front reaction shaft here with its bearing. And I'm using a late front planet carrier set. So I have a 30,000 shim in there that came with this. And then my front planet carrier with the bearing that came with the Sonic's reaction shaft in there. Slide that in. Or rather struggle to slide that in because I'm filming. There we go. So we got that together. So bam, there's that. Let me get my snap ring on. Give me a minute here. Go grab the tool. Pause. All right, and there we have our front snap ring installed. And there's what our assembly looks like. Now, let me set this up so we can check it. Okay, and I'm going to show setting this up 2 different ways here, just for demonstration purposes so we can see what's going on. The first one is going to be, let me get this in frame. With this is part of a wheel bearing installation tool set that I use with the press. I'm going to set this on the front carrier here. Let's see what we can see. Well, I better take the phone out of this janky tripod. All right, so with that set up like that, so we're supported, we're off the ground. I'm supporting this whole part stack up. The output shaft is now sitting on that flange now. I can pick that up and move it. And that is our actual output shaft end play. So let me set this up the other way to make it easier to check. All right, the other way we're going to set this up for the purpose of checking it, which is what you're going to want to do to check your end play. Again, let me figure out how to hold all this. We're going to set this up against that. So we're going to set the front of the output shaft up on this so everything's floating again. Make sure that's in frame. Alright, so this gets set up here and we're going to balance it so it doesn't fall over. Alright, now with that set up there, the weight of all the parts, gravity's pulling them downward. So now we already have the gap right there, and then we can go ahead and check that with a feeler gauge. There's other ways to do this, but this is probably the simplest and the easiest. So let me get my feeler gauges out, and I'll show that in a second. All right, so I have a 20 thousandths and a 16 thousandths feeler gauge here, and these I can fit in around here with slight drag on any side of this, which pretty much matches the measurement that I made in the transmission with only the rear end assembled, and as well as with it all assembled. So that is what we're going to want to try and adjust, although depending on what spec you look at, one of them says 10 to 20 thousandths and another says 20 to 30 thousandths. I don't think there's any official published spec in a manual, at least not that I've found. It looks like the primary thing that you're checking when you do this is whether you have a correct parts stack up, because there's a lot of ways to mess up the parts stack up with different reaction shafts, different front planets, the wrong bearings, and just incorrect assembly in general. There is a shim that I originally purchased because I found there's some conflicting documentation online. And this is before I figured this out completely, understood what was being adjusted. Got some different shims in here. Find one of the correct ones. I think that's it. Yeah, so there's these shims that would go back here, and those they say they're to adjust end play, and there's some on the forums. I found some screenshots of manuals where they were showing adjusting output shaft end play with these that look like they're obsolete, and they've been removed from any of the websites of the manufacturer of these shims. This is just going to move this whole assembly forward in the case, and it's just going to move all of these parts. If I put a 10,000 shim here, it's going to move the parts 10 thousandths forward, and then I will need a smaller shim or a 10,000 smaller shim on the front of my input drum. So this doesn't affect the movement of my output shaft because the output shaft is still floating. So this is useless to me. You would have to, there's actually a patent online where they show a shim that goes in here on this splined area. It's a splined shim. Can't find that in production anywhere, and they show a Torrington bearing in that area as well, which would be also unnecessary. The other thing you could do is put a shim behind that snap ring, but again, it would have to be splined. So in order to affect the end play or the fore and aft movement of this output shaft in this part stack, you effectively have to add something in between this flange and the backside of the snap ring. Also want to point out that if I did not have my center support assembled and I just had, this is my old non-Sonics low roller sprag clutch race, if I just had that out of my center support in my assembly over here, then this whole thing I could flip over and drop into my case right now for purposes of checking. All right, just to kind of show this again, down in there, that seal at the back, the reddish brownish one, that's where the end of the output shaft is floating. That's a lube seal. So the output shaft itself isn't affecting the total unit end play. This whole parts assembly, when I slide this sun gear up against that Torrington bearing, it's floating between the backside of this bearing where it hits the case and the bearing up here that goes on the front of that shim. So that bearing goes up there. So we're between the edges of those two bearings. That's up against the stator. So when I change that shim in the front, or when I change, after I have all the internal parts assembled correctly, change that front shim, or if I add a shim here, that's affecting my front end play or my total unit end play. It's not going to affect the movement of my output shaft within this rear parts assembly. All right, so first I thought I was wrong, but I was just mistaken. This shim that can go back here, which will adjust total unit end play, not output shaft end play, as we discussed. When I first pulled my front planet carrier out to look and see if this would fit, it is absolutely the wrong diameter. On further inspection and re-watching a couple videos, this is close to being the correct diameter for this, but it's a little bit too small of an ID. And I believe that's because this is the older style front planetary. This is actually a bearing for a newer one. This won't fit on here. And you can look at Sonic's reaction shaft instructions if you want to learn more about the different bearings here, or if you're having an assembly problem due to that. This appears to be correct for a late one. So now, before we get confused, let's get this out of here. What I'm going to try and do is remove some material from the inside of this shim so that it will drop all the way down on here. My only concern at that point, this bearing right here is located by this kind of angled part of this race here, so that it can't come out of there. It stays in place. So I just want to make sure that once I fit this shim, or any of these shims, whatever shims I need to fit, so that they sit down here flush, that I still have enough of a step there that my bearing can't come out of place, which I can also be sure of by making sure that my front end play is adjusted correctly, because then these parts can't spread apart from one another. So let me get that figured out, and then we'll keep going here. All right, I'm going to just say I don't know that it's absolutely necessary to adjust this output shaft end play, considering it's just floating in there, but I don't like the amount of movement I have. Preferably, this is the Sonic's reaction shaft that comes with a 30,000 shim. I would love to just swap this out for a 40 or 50,000 shim, but this is not readily available listed for a 4L60E, so I would have to source another shim, which I'm not going to do. There's also probably other places in this stack where you could add a shim. I thought about using one of my extra shims and sitting it in there, but I don't feel like, I don't want to go through and check the clearance and the engagement of all these splines and all the parts. So what we're going to do is add the shim on the back of the front planet. And my recommendation, if you do it this way, use this Sonic's part number, 77406-10. I bought shims that were listed under, well, they have a TransStar part number, they have a tri-component part number, and they come in selective sizes. These Sonics come in 10,000s only. These come in anywhere from 10 to, I believe, like 45,000s. The ID is different, and I know that because the Sonic's ID is listed, and this was too small there is a slight angle down in there, right there, and it's slight. Doesn't matter for the bearing, because the bearing is angled right there. So the bearing goes down and it stays centered. But the shims that I had, they didn't go all the way down, so I would have had it would have looked like I had less clearance than I did, and the bearing, the Torrington bearing, wouldn't be sitting flat, which would be no good. So I would just use those, but I wouldn't use any more than a 10,000th shim in this location. Is that 20 sitting here somewhere still? Oh, I don't know where the other one went, but a 20,000th, I really don't like how far up this is. It'll move further this direction, and I don't like how far it is off of what's keeping it centered. So we're gonna run this, and what we come up with is what we come up with. So this is how that's going in. Let me go ahead and we'll throw this back together. All right, we're playing. All right, we're gonna throw this together. Here's the rear ring gear and hub with bearing stuck to the back. Piston and everything is already installed down here. Set that down in. Rear planet carrier with bearing. Set that down in there. All right. And then we've got center support. Center support, we do have, can you see that? There's our anti-clunk spring right there, stuck up there with grease. And then let's clock this guy. Shove her down in there. All right. Snap ring. Snap ring's gonna have the opening over the anti-clunk spring. This can be a little bit of a bear to get in here in the right position. Easy to put in, just not easy to put in the right position. Walk on you as you go. All right, that was actually easier than expected. All right, and then where are we at here? All right, so sun gear, sun shell bearing for the Sonics Smart Shell. That's gonna make with that race. Drop this guy down in there. Alright, Sonic's reaction shaft, bearing, shim. Alright, that looks good. Alright, and then on the back of our front planet, we've got, oh, and I'm going to need some grease. But we've got our shim and our bearing in the correct direction. And we'll drop that down there. Go ahead, pause. All right, we've got those stuck on there. So we'll drop this down in. And then, do you think I can get this snap ring on in here, or should we stick it back in the press?
You can do it here. Just tilt it over like you did before.
Let's try it. Why not?
You want to pause or?
I just back up a little bit. Like literally back up. snap ring is getting worn, so I'm going to put it in a certain way here. Or shoot it across the rim, either way. This is going to be a little bit hard to do, huh?
You pause and set
That's
that,
right.
set that on something.
Keep it going. Alright, and then I always double check that my snap rings are all the way in the groove. And it is. So, alright, you can go ahead and pause that. And we did leave the clutches out for now. We're going to have to soak those before we do final assembly anyways. But for purpose of checking end play, this will work. And I will also add that the clutches in the input drum, I'm not going to take it back apart now, but if you left the 3/4 clutches out, it'd be easier. And if you're installing the reverse drum for a mock-up, then it would also be easier to leave the clutches out of that until you get all your end play measurements done. All right, also going to add here, these are the old seals. We're going to leave those since we're still setting up our end play. I actually had, I think I said earlier, had the front end play adjusted, but now it will have changed, so we're going to fix that. So there's that. And we also have, so yeah, like I said, we could leave these clutches out. We also have the old seal down inside of here. And let's see, I'm going to pull the bearing and the shim off. Easier said than done. Stuck that on there. We're going to need the smaller shim, so we'll start by getting these lined up. Reasonably. Probably would still be easier to take those out, but that's all right. And we're leaving the reverse drum out for now because it does not affect the total end play clearance. All right, I felt that bottom. There's the thunk where it's hitting the Torrington bearing. And I guess I need to find shim so you can hit pause. Got some different shims here. Not really sure what we're going to need, but we're going to pick a smaller one than what we had in there, which in this case happens to be a number 68. We're going to see what we end up with. Bam, bam. And we are doing this with the gasket. These gaskets are 99 cents from Transtar or from Transmax LLC on eBay. So no reason not to have a couple extras on hand and set up your end play with it instead of having to guess what the difference is going to be. We're not using any alignment dowels or anything for this. I was able to just take the pump, and there's no seal on it here. I've got this taped off just to avoid debris getting in there. And we're going to want that pointed down. And we're going to look down in the hole for a bolt hole. Alright, I gotta watch these other ones. I'm using the light on the phone. Just get these visually lined up here. And I'm just gonna barely set this on, and then it's probably gonna fall down on me. Barely set that there, and we're gonna take 3 bolts. Get them started with just finger loose, and we've got this sitting up high here. So we can still move it, and we can get these bolts to line up. Alright, so we got 3 bolts started. So we'll put that down. And just run these down. I'm not going to torque them. We don't know if our shim is too big yet, so we want to be really gentle. Very gentle. We're just going to give that a little tiny bit. Just a little bit. Alright, now we'll set this up and check the input shaft end play. Alright, we're just going to do an initial check here. Okay, we do have some movement. So at this point, we'll go ahead and, well, we'll set this up here to check end play for real in a minute. And you can end that video. Alright, we were set up to measure the output end play already. We've got a workable setup here. Need the vice grips to set up the input shaft measuring setup, so we'll do this one first. Push down. There's our 0. And we got about 28. So that's it, within one of the sets of specifications that we found. So we're going to call it good. We just ran 2 bolts on that extension housing. We're just going to run 2 bell housing bolts as well. Alright, so we have this set up to measure input shaft end play. We started by pushing downward on the shaft and zeroing the gauge, so we get our total movement. And we're going to now pull up. And we've got about 25 thousandths. That's with the gasket installed. So we are going to shim this because that's kind of the maximum we want for reliability. Alright, that's the number 68 selective shim that we just pulled out, which this one happens to measure about 81 thousandths. Another option we have here is this one, 101.5. This is an aftermarket that does not have a usable number on it. Don't know what 19C is. And we also have here this Sonics shim to make this easier to adjust. That's supposed to be, it's a nominal 15, but it measures 14, and I'll also show there's a part number for that, 77409-15. So we're going to start by throwing the number 68 and the 15 in, and then we'll set this up and remeasure it. End it. We're going to zero this out. We've got that 15,000 shim in there with the number 68, so I'm going to force this downward. We'll go to 0. Now we're going to pull up. And we've got about 10 thousandths, which should be perfect. Even if we crush the gasket a little bit, then we should still be over the 5, but we'll double check it once we go to torque down the pump. All right.